Good evening. Thanks for joining, everyone. Okay, I think we will just start, and then if people are joining, they can hopefully catch up because, yeah, they won't have missed too much so long as they join shortly. And we can maybe catch other people up. We will have some breakout rooms later, and that might be a chance for people to find out about anything they missed. Well, I'd like to just say a big welcome to everyone and a big thank you for giving some of your time and attention to this meeting this evening at what is a busy time of year for a lot of people. So it's much appreciated. Oh gosh, there's a couple more people joining. I'm just going to give them a moment.
Whilst people join, can I just say thank you very much, Damien, for putting Tom Goodall from Canterbury Cathedral in touch with me. I went to see him last Monday about their programme. It sounds really exciting.
It's nice, Alison. That's good to hear.
Great. Okay. I think we'll get started now, and then I'll try not to. Oh gosh, I've just seen someone else joining who I know hasn't been for a while. Okay, a couple more seconds, and then we will really start for real this time. Okay. Well, good evening, everyone. Again, second time trying to start. A warm welcome to everyone. I hope the sound is okay. Please make a noise or make a signal if it's not. And that goes for any time during the evening. We want to make sure that everyone's seeing everything and hearing everything clearly. And just to mention again, we are planning to record this and share the video as with previous meetings on the Trellis website, which is where most of our professional association stuff is going from these meetings. It's really good of you to give up some time on a busy December week to come to this meeting this evening. And so we really appreciate that. Thank you for deciding to give your time to this meeting. We are going to focus on role definitions tonight. So the reason for this is, well, there's many reasons for this, but our thinking has been that one of the central functions of the professional association is going to be to establish a register of practitioners. And one of the things that we will need to do is be clear about what we mean by a practitioner. What do we mean by a social and therapeutic horticulture practitioner? And this is not just for our own, for our own common collective understanding to make sure that we're all talking about the same things, but also for our application to the Professional Standards Authority to have our register recognised by them. And we were talking, some of the Thrive and Trellis team were talking, and we realised we might all be making a bunch of assumptions about what we mean about these roles. Maybe it's more than one. That's one assumption. Maybe it's one, maybe it's more than one. And we might also be assuming things about what level of practice, relative to other professions in the UK and around the world, what level of practice we're talking about, and the kind of skills and everyday activities and tasks that these practitioners are getting involved in. So we thought it would be really important to have an open discussion about this. And it won't just be tonight we discuss it and it's signed, sealed and delivered in a closed subject. It'll be the beginning tonight and then an ongoing discussion. But we will aim to get to some sort of agreed definition so that we are clear about what we mean when we talk about a practitioner of social and therapeutic horticulture. And I think that is going to be one of the functions of the professional association, is to hold these agreed collective definitions. It's the same in every other profession. We know what we mean by a teacher, a secondary school teacher or a primary school teacher, and we know what we mean by a nurse or a doctor. And so we do need to define what we mean by these roles. And secondly, the Professional Standards Authority will ask us exactly that question. You know, please define your role. Which role are you registering? Are there going to be one or more than one roles on your register? And so this is something that we need to hear from you about. We need to have a really thorough consultation about what you mean by your own definition of therapeutic horticulture practitioner, and check that out with our colleagues here in the group tonight, and possibly also with colleagues that we see during the week away from this meeting. And so we realized, talking amongst ourselves at Thrive and Trellis, that we were probably making some assumptions, and we probably had some ideas about a particular level that we were thinking of for most practitioners, and possibly a future level that might be higher than that, and certain skills that might be involved in those roles. And so tonight is a chance to really start giving this a good airing and seeing how much in common we have with our concepts here. And I'm thinking it will be quite a lot, but let's see. And it's going to be necessary to do this and to really have a thorough discussion about this. The professional association itself could have a membership scheme, which could be separate from the register. So as well as being a registered practitioner, you could be an association member, and this could have lots of different levels and be separate from the register. And so we're not really talking about that tonight. We're talking about being on the register and being a practitioner that is recognized on this register and publicly proclaimed to be so. So that's what we're talking about. So I think we probably have some certain assumptions about the kind of people we're working with. We're assuming that most of us agree that as a practitioner, we're probably working with people who have a defined support need or a diagnosis that they are somehow vulnerable and have need of support and therapeutic intervention. But are we talking about people who work with groups only, or with individuals and groups, or individuals only? And are we talking about a knowledge base that includes horticulture and therapeutic or health and care skills and therapeutic horticulture skills? Or are we talking about a subset of those and group dynamic skills and knowledge of risk assessment and other things too? So we won't have time to get into all this very wide, but the kind of assumptions we were realizing that we might all be making are in these areas. And also, how does your practice, what does a practitioner, how do they relate to other roles out there in the working world? You know, for example, care workers or nurses or occupational therapists and occupational therapist technicians or other such roles. So this could get really wide, and we have a limited time tonight. So we've got a few simple, not simple, but a few limited questions for us to focus on, and we will break into groups. And these definitions will be refined over time, so it'll be a process. It won't be definitive tonight or any other time, but we will need a starting working definition. So we have discussed this a little bit among ourselves, and Damien is also going to share with us some slides that help us think a bit more about this. And then after that, we're going to break into groups and have a discussion in smaller groups to see if we can come to some agreement or get some ideas on paper about what these roles might be and why they might be the way they are at different levels or one level only, and so on and so forth. And then we'll come back together, and then we will hopefully share our ideas and see how much common ground we have or not. And then we'll have some notes that we will then be able to refer back to later. So I think that's probably enough from me, and I'd like to hand over to Damien, who's going to speak for another 10 or 15 minutes with some slides that he's brought. Any questions until this point? Comments? Okay. All right. So Damien, would you like to take over and share your screen? And I'll put myself on mute. Thanks.
Perfect. Yes, so let's have a little bit of a think. So I've just got a few slides to share with you. So just bear with me, and I've just had to add two of them because when I re-entered it, it looked as if I'd not saved the last two slides. So luckily I could pretty much remember what I put. So I've been able to just put them back together as they should be. So let's start from the beginning though. Let's go back. And so, yes, so we'll have a little bit of a think about the way in which we can perhaps begin to collectively define social and therapeutic horticulture, understand, what is a practitioner, as Fiona's talking about, and perhaps think about the different skill sets that people use in the way that they are enacting their role. Now, I've always thought that social and therapeutic horticulture is incredibly context dependent because we're using a multimodal approach. And so, we're using time in nature, time being active and occupied, time in a social environment. But we're often overlapping that with other elements. So for example, we might be working in a conservation, environmental, or organic approach. We might be working in a heritage garden, and all of these things we sort of maximize and make the most of within our context to support the individuals and groups who come into our programs. So I thought it'd be useful for us to sort of think this through initially by just very briefly looking at a couple of definitions, but then more importantly, perhaps thinking about the different models that have been identified in relation to social and therapeutic horticulture, but also, coming from the horticulture therapy models that you might see in North America and so on. And obviously these models sit underneath theory and definitions as a way of distinguishing approaches, giving us an opportunity to understand the different ways in which we can essentially utilize the same medium, perhaps because we're working in different models or because we're working with different groups of people and so on. All models in STH, I think, do tend to use these similar mechanisms, and perhaps those, time in nature, time in a social environment, time active and occupied is used slightly differently in different STH settings and different programs. So, for example, if you're working with people with progressed dementia, then you're more likely to be engaging people in more experiential time in nature rather than necessarily very active time doing complex gardening tasks, which we might do with other groups. But essentially, we're, immersing people in nature, engaging them in activity while we're in perhaps a social context of some description. Quite often in SDH, that's a group, but not always. Sometimes we're working on a one-to-one basis. And when we do that, there's still a social context, the social context of the practitioner and the client gardener. Now, in the real world, I think that in general, practitioners don't necessarily just stick to a defined model. I think we do the very sensible thing of making the most of the opportunities in front of us, and responding very intuitively at times, or intuitively, maybe not the right word, but using our praxis, if you like, our combined education and experience to make good choices in how we can engage individuals and groups in our context of SDH. And so in the real world, these models get blended together, I think. We will ask you to have a think about these models in the breakout and think about the skills associated with delivering them. And so do please take a few notes as I go through this to help you with that breakout session. So let's just think about the spectrum of definitions that you can find. There are dozens of definitions in relation to horticulture therapy, STH, therapeutic horticulture, and a whole host of other ways of describing essentially what we collectively do as practitioners. Some of these tend to be more medically or clinically modelled, and the one on the top here is the current American Hort Therapy Association definition. It says that horticulture therapy is the participation in horticultural activities facilitated by a registered horticultural therapist to achieve specific goals within an established treatment, rehabilitation or vocational plan. horticulture therapy is an active process which occurs in the context of an established treatment plan, where the process itself is considered the therapeutic activity rather than the end product. Now that's, for me, talking about established treatment plans, talking about registered therapists, this is a more clinical medical model of horticulture therapy, I think. You can find more, socially or wellness modeled descriptions as well. So therapeutic horticulture is the process by which individuals may develop well-being using plants and horticulture. This is achieved by active or passive involvement. That's a more wellness or socially modeled idea, perhaps more holistically modeled, we could call it. And that was essentially a chosen definition by a group of practitioners back in 1998-99 at Thrive, that was published in Growth Point in 99. But then we can think about definitions that perhaps are really quite broad. We could even describe them as vague, but perhaps we can, all discuss and think about the value of having longer definitions with more detail and more elements to them versus perhaps this final one, a broader one that perhaps offers a description that accommodates all on a spectrum rather than necessarily tries to define along any type of model of healthcare or idea in relation to wellness and things like this. So the participation of vulnerable people and groups in activities centered on horticulture, distinct from other horticulture, by the way, is formalized around the user's needs, from Sempeck and Spurgeon 2006 at a conference. And so, there are a whole host of definitions, and at some point as we registrate, we're going to need to choose one essentially. I think, as you can see with the current AHTA one, that actually this question never disappears. This one that they currently use is around about 2 or 3 years old, I believe. I've seen in my 14 years at Thrive, I think 3 or 4 different iterations from the American Hort Therapy Association. So I think that, naturally and correctly, these definitions have to change over time, essentially, because the context in which we're working changes over time. The way in which we think about health, the way in which health is administered through a system of care, these things change. And as those things change, perhaps we have to change our definition. If I think back to when I started at Thrive, or certainly when I started in healthcare over pushing 30 years ago now, the concept of what defined mental illness or mental health back then was very different to what it is now. Just as an example of how the context that surrounds us in STH changes over time, and naturally we have to change to fit that changing agenda in order to remain relevant and useful to people. But underneath all of these models, we can perhaps think about slightly differentiated approaches to the way in which they are used. But in doing so, I think it's important to recognize what unites all of us, perhaps, what perhaps we all share in common. In literature, depending on the way in which the research study is looking at horticulture therapy or STH, it all tends to point to these 3 valuable mechanisms. So you find research that expresses how people benefit from time in a natural environment. You find some research that highlights that within that natural environment, the social processes, the social context, the social environment is important. And then you'll find other studies that also look at the way in which activity and occupation has been one of the drivers of the benefits associated with engaging in STH for a whole range of different client groups and different users. And I suppose underneath these headings, we could think of a number of different examples of what we mean by that. The ones I've put up on the screen here are just examples. They're not in any way an exhaustive list. They're not the definitive ones. They were just what come into my head as I was putting this slide together yesterday. And so, sometimes when you as practitioners use nature, perhaps you're valuing the way in which people can experience it, how people can go into a space that has aesthetic value and beauty, perhaps representing creativity and art. For some people, it's about the way in which we connect to nature. And certainly nature connection and the concept of affinity for nature has grown over the years to say that it's not just about any type of nature. It's about connecting with nature that is in line with your own preferences, in line with your own norms and values. And so it might be about wildlife as well as plants, or it might be about a certain style of horticulture. But all of the time there's that psychoevolutionary thing, things going on underneath that. Subconsciously, attention restoration theory, or the more emotional impact that Ulrich describes, is occurring and clear in evidence base. You know, we now have it down to just 5 minutes is enough to change mood and so on. And then when it comes to the social environment, maybe it's about a sense of belonging, long identified by occupational therapists who researched on Battersea at Battersea Regional Centre at Thrive. I know that all of you will have watched many friendships and rich social interactions in the time that you've had delivering as practitioners. But then when we're working with certain groups of people, perhaps there's elements of talking therapy. I think every practitioner can benefit from developing good active listening skills. Others have defined it more in line with presence theory, where perhaps we're not necessarily quite as clinical in the way that we work as some talking therapists would, but essentially through that process of active listening, provide a presence, provide a reassurance to people that somebody's listening, somebody is seeing that person and understanding the challenges that they're facing. But then also, I guess, you know, there's that activity side of things from that occupational therapy perspective, trying to think about what's meaningful for people. We can do this through the model of human occupation and others. But also for many, it's about skills development and the feeling of competence that comes from completing a job and getting tasks well done and seeing the rewards. And of course, you know, when we look at these three components, they're never isolated. They're always interacting with each other. The flexibility of horticulture enables us to connect people to activities that they will be able to achieve, and enables us to be very focused on what people can do and not on what they can't. And then, of course, you know, the way in which that can actually make a difference to the way that people feel about themselves, their identity, and how it can change personal causation. You know, certainly when we work again with people perhaps with conditions associated with aging, people recovering from neuro injuries and things like this, then to be able to change that person's personal causation so they believe in themselves again and see themselves as capable people who can be productive and make a difference to those around them. And so perhaps one way or another, you as practitioners are using these different elements. I've always thought you can balance these three things however you want, however seems right for the group that you're working with. Sometimes it's more about nature, sometimes it's more about the social environment, and other times it's all about occupation and doing things. And so when we think about these three mechanisms that drive the outcomes that we can see in research, I think it's important to recognize that these things tend to, in my experience anyway, essentially create a shared identity for what we do in social and therapeutic horticulture, even though sometimes we're working in very different models and different approaches. I think in the UK, because we've generally been a bottom-up movement without so much academic input in early years, certainly, then perhaps you can identify some extra models. Sometimes these models are a little bit different as well because of the UK context. If you look in lots of literature, and of course lots of the literature comes from North America, you'll more often see models described as therapeutic, wellness, or vocational. And I think therapeutic in North America often is in relation to medical or clinical work, because essentially that's who insurance is going to pay for. But in the UK, I think you can identify therapeutic models within social care, as well as more clinical therapeutic models. And so that's why, you know, when I talk about it, I often think that there is a therapeutic model without doubt, but there's probably also a more clinical one in the UK as well. The wellness one probably perhaps encompasses the majority of people who practice in STH. But I think that from that, you know, many people who practice in that wellness model, they started off in a community garden. And perhaps, you know, like me, you've seen many a community garden essentially start with aims of supporting the community and generally being a great place to come. But then realizing that they're starting to attract people with defined needs, people who need a little bit of additional consideration. And then that setting and the group of people who look after that setting tend to then start to focus on arranging their gardens so it works for the people rather than just working for plants. And in doing so, perhaps move from a community garden towards the STH spectrum, but perhaps with that inception being about social, being about inclusivity, perhaps that model remains. And then, slightly separated from all of these, less on the same spectrum as the others, I think, is a vocational model. We just look at three of these in detail, the three that you see most commonly described in literature. But I think it's always worth just noting that, it might be a little bit different. We've not really examined this in an academic way in the UK that much or through research. But from the benefit I get of visiting many a different place around the UK, I can certainly think I can identify these different models. Therapeutic models, they have some commonality, and I think some of that commonality begins with the way in which their outcomes are very defined, or sometimes individually specific to the needs of the person. I think because our medium is holistic, the practitioner always acknowledges those holistic outcomes, and I think that's really important for an authentic experience for each client gardener. But I do think that actually, quite often in therapeutic work, when perhaps our referrals are coming from health and social care agencies, there's an expectation that we're working towards identified outcomes and that we're documenting those outcomes using an outcome measurement approach. Very often these programs tend to be time limited. Again, what we're doing here is perhaps working with people who are at a more acute stage of ill health or more recently experiencing ill health or disability. And there's an importance about not creating dependence that I think is viewed here that we tend to take on board. And also in order to satisfy the need for efficiency within a service that is serving people with more acute or more recently defined needs. And so you tend to have time limited programs, or perhaps at least very clear review points so we can check that person still needs to come, rather than being perhaps signposted to a more wellness model or even a community garden approach. Referrals from health and social care agents, perhaps there's some individual planning and engagement with the individuals in that planning, which might lead to more one-to-one time where you're actually scheduling in time to ensure that you check in, because we're essentially acknowledging that we're describing ourselves as a therapeutic model, which creates expectation in our users, but also that perhaps with that more acute or more recent health need, there's more of a need to be scheduled in the way that we work. It can be quite practitioner-led, and activities perhaps more often allocated, or even we could describe it as being prescribed in line with outcomes. Activity isn't all relative. Occupational therapists will identify different tasks that have different qualities. And I know in this, when you give this presentation, you only see a few people who are in this room, and I can see both Claire Farley and Alison Marsden as students at Thrive, who would have gone through that occupational therapy approach to recognise qualities of activity, to recognise essentially that some activities give you the opportunity to practice certain skills. And perhaps when we're working towards more defined outcomes, that's what we're doing. It's likely to have smaller group sizes, ratios from 1-to-1 all the way up to maybe 1-to-8, and anything in between. It might be volunteer supported like everything else in STH, because we're in that not-for-profit sector more often than not, and finance is always limiting on resources. There are a number of really clearly identifiable therapeutic programs around the UK, although I have chosen one from Ireland here as well because I know it so well. But Higher Ground, Anna Baker Cresswell's work with Headley Court, the rehabilitation centre for service personnel, that's very much a therapeutic model. We might even say that's an example of that clinical model that I was describing, because they are working to very specific clinical outcomes in an integrated model, working in multidisciplinary teams with other healthcare professionals. And then I've, highlighted the Milford Centre. The Milford Centre is a palliative care centre near Limerick. Zoe, who perhaps some of you have had the pleasure of hearing from, delivers that programme there. And again, this is very integrated into the healthcare approach to palliative care, and also the dementia service they provide from that setting. It carries some of the hallmarks we've looked at here, and Zoe quite recently has been able to develop a referral process alongside the other complementary therapies. So at the Milford Centre, you can see STH, music therapy and art therapy all being offered to the same patients, but with a clear referral process that helps identify who should do what. And I think that's a hallmark of a professional therapeutic programme. Thrive's own core programme is also essentially a therapeutically modelled programme. Every 3 or 6 months, we're reviewing people's individual goals, and we're having, we're designing programmes in order to maximise the use of activity in supporting outcomes. But like I say, perhaps the majority of practitioners in the UK are somewhere closer to the wellness model, where the focus is on the holistic, documenting outcomes as they occur, hopefully, and sometimes also, outcome measuring more broad outcomes that might be defined. They can be more open-ended as a programme length, but not always. There's always variation in all of these things, and of course, exceptions. The referrals could also come from those health or social care agencies, but often self-referrals are here. If I think about the Martineau Gardens and places like this, they're very they very specifically choose to be self-referred. Okay, believing themselves to reach people in the community that perhaps the statutory services won't. Although there was, always going to be plenty of individual discussions, and perhaps that practitioner is using good skills every single day, every single session, in order to be able to identify when somebody's not their best or not having a good day, and adjust the way that they're treating that person, how they're conversing with that person, the activities they're choosing, and things like this. So although there might not be as documented or as scheduled a plan, I think that there very much is an underlying approach that's happening underneath it. Perhaps it's more democratic and leadership style. Perhaps groups are involved in more decisions about what they do in the garden and what activities they do on any given day. Potentially here we could work in larger groups, couldn't we? Perhaps 1 to 6, anywhere up to 1 to 30, I think is possible, although 30 always sounds like a lot. And perhaps you need some really good, well-trained volunteers to back you up on that sort of programme. There are loads of examples of this. Forest Farm Peace Garden is a really great example of this. And I've chosen that one because, again, I think this is one that you might identify as being potentially even more socially modelled, with all of the work it does with people from different communities, and its work with refugees. Then it values inclusivity at a level that perhaps makes that social model worth thinking about. But then we can see Veterans Growth acting as a wellness model down near Hastings, Sarah Wilson's programme. And that's very much a wellness model in contrast to High Ground, a therapeutic model. So these models can be not necessarily defined by client group, but perhaps defined by the way we're funded sometimes, perhaps defined by what's possible, by the pragmatism versus a bottom-up movement making things happen. And then you can go to Syrians up in the Royal Edinburgh Community Hospital, where essentially that wellness programme has replaced some of the occupational therapy that used to be on offer in a more activity-centred way, with OTs often taking a more clinical role sometimes, with assessment and so on. Sirenian, sorry, I should have pronounced it better, in many ways have stepped in to support that work. And so it's always interesting to see how in more clinical settings, they can make use of SDH in different ways, sometimes complementing the clinical, other times offering something different in that environment, which could be equally useful. And then, of course, this slightly off the spectrum model. It's not on the spectrum of health so much, the vocational model. The focus here on learning skills, possibly sheltered employment, possible limited time programme for learning aims like alternative provision, but certainly more open-ended programs for sheltered employment. Referrals can be, local education authorities or local authority social care still. Possible leadership is more managerial or more like, the role of practitioner becomes more like a teacher on some of those programs. The potential group size may be 1 to 4, 1 to 16. And here I think you can see lots of example programs around the UK, but ones that are quite, interesting are the Shore Trust programs, for example. There are lots of Shore Trusts who provide STH, but they do so in a vocational model because as an organisation who work with people with intellectual disability, learning disability, they focus very much on the value that employment gives to that person. And so without doubt, they are vocational models. But just as ever, as a practitioner, when you're working with those individuals, you're going to adjust to those people's needs. Working it out has been going for a really long time down in cherry trees. And one of the things that often you see in vocational models is that overlapping agenda, perhaps working in a heritage garden or perhaps in a social enterprise like cherry trees down in Bournemouth, supplying the local authority with what must be an absolute ton of bedding plants every season. But also the Thrive Pathways programme is one here, which essentially has a vocational component to it, working with people with mental ill health to get them comfortable. And then if they want to, they can go on to gain an MVQ in horticulture through a vocational end to the programme. And I wanted to put that one up there just to put across that these different models could be developed in the same organization. So we can have different programs running out the same organization. And that means that sometimes the practitioner has to adopt slightly different hats in order to appropriately discharge their role in a way that's right for the program and more importantly, right for the individuals who attend. So that's the end of my slides. And I'm not sure whether, as ever, with being busy, I'm not sure whether these are the questions that Fiona had in mind to ask. So Fiona, you feel free to ask other questions if they're more suited. But I thought, thinking about skills to connect people to nature, the way in which you use skills to engage people in activity, what the skills of the practitioner to support the environment, the social environment, and the talking side of what we do. Lovely.
Thanks, Damien. I hope that's got some thoughts going. That's got some given some oil to your thought processes. We are going to break into smaller groups now. I think, how many do we have? 25 people, so maybe 5 groups of 5, and I'm hoping that someone very clever is going to do the Zoom magic and make that happen in just a short while. We would like you to think about a few questions that I'm going to post in the chat with the idea of what defines the role of social and therapeutic horticulture practitioner. How do you think of it as being defined? In mind always, and hopefully not getting too much into the semantics, because language could take us, we could spend a week discussing the terminology, and I know it's come up a lot during my time working in this field. But we have been using, this is one of the assumptions we realized we were making, we've been using the term practitioner for lots of good reasons that we've had debates about with different people at different times, but not really with this big collective group here. And it's time we did start having these discussions. We use the term practitioner for various reasons, but other groups, the other terms are in circulation in the UK and in other countries. Some people speak about therapists. We at Trellis, we definitely don't use that word for various reasons. And some other groups are also proposing the term facilitator, which it would be good to have your thoughts about. So maybe that could be one of the things that you think about when you get into your discussion in these breakout rooms. Why one and why not the other? Or maybe you're kind of keen on all of them and you can see benefits or drawbacks to all of them, or you have a very definite preference. That would be good to be thinking about. We are going to need to, a note taker in each of the groups, and a spokesperson. So that could be the same person, but if you could try to nominate someone who doesn't mind taking a few notes, just to help us have a more cohesive and comprehensive record of these consultations at the end, because we can't all be in all of the groups. So if you could do that. And the questions I would like you to consider in these groups is, first of all, what makes you a social and therapeutic horticulture practitioner, if you are one indeed, or what makes someone you know, if you're not one, what makes someone you know a practitioner? What would you need to take away to stop you or the other person being a social and therapeutic horticulture practitioner? What are the essential traits that make them that practitioner? And if they didn't have X or Y, then they wouldn't be a practitioner anymore. What are those essential elements? And finally, and if you have time, how does your practice or your role compare to other roles you can think about or that you've come across in related professions? For example, care workers, occupational therapists, horticulturalists of different levels, possibly art therapists or music therapists. How does your role or your practice compare to those people, those roles? How do you see it pegged to other roles in the health and care professions or the vocational professions? So we are just a little bit over time, so I'm going to give you 20 minutes for this task. We had given it a bit longer, but I think we should probably cut it down so that we've got time to come together at the end, if that's okay. I think we can probably do that just use a timer. Is everyone clear about this, about what we're going to discuss now in these groups? Okay, I'm going to put the questions in the chat just as a reminder. And I think now would be a good time to go off into our rooms, and then we welcome you back in about 20 minutes. I don't know about you, but we were in full flow, in full speed, and we got cut off. It seemed to go very quickly. So I think that's good, because it would have been awful if we all sat there with nothing to say. So I'm just going to call on the spokesperson, or the person who was paying most attention in each of the groups, who could perhaps share with us perhaps a 2 to 3, maybe even 5-minute update on what were the themes, what were the flashpoints, what were the areas of agreement, what did your group come up with? Who would like to go first, please? I think, were there 4 groups or 5? 5 groups. Yeah, thanks, Ben. So group number 1, nominate yourself as group number 1, and we'll hear.
Hi Fiona, it's Marie here. So I was in group 1 with Francesca, Kathleen and Vicky. I think we could see that our names on the screen, and Emma. So the first thing, what defines the role of the STH practitioner? What we were saying was the people-plant connection, and Francesca gave us a term that we didn't know before of ethnobotany. It's ETHNO botany, and it is the connection between people and plants and the effect on people working with plants. It's that people-plant connection that brings about the therapeutic benefits to the person that's engaging in the activities. So that was the main kind of thing that defines it, is that the people plant. So we definitely needed the horticulture bit in it, or gardening, whether it's termed horticulture and that sounds too technical, or whether it's gardening for well-being or something, but it's the people plant connection. The second thing of what would you need to take away to change your role would be the STH training, being able to connect people with plants, having an ability to facilitate a group, and this is where the facilitator term came in again, and but also being trained in being able to train people, trained in safeguarding, working with vulnerable people, and leadership. So there's a whole lot of skills that had to be, you know, that are in it that you would need to take away. And then thirdly, and we just started speaking about this at the end, was how does your role compare to like occupational therapists, horticulturists, and art and music therapists? And Kathleen was saying that from her background in healthcare, the active listening and the, you know, being able to recognise people's situations and how to signpost them or help them, compared with healthcare kind of positions. Horticulture, my background is horticulture, but obviously the difference is there's a big part of it's horticulture, but the big difference is having to communicate with people as well, and having to like manage groups and being able to be kind of responsive to whatever way the group is going, kind of thing, you know, whatever you need to do to change. Anybody else in group one wants to jump in now and correct me or add things in there? I'd be grateful.
Oh, Marie, I think you did a great job. A lot of discussion about terms, but yeah, no, I have nothing more to add. Thanks.
I think the terminology depended on where you trained or who you trained with. So I would be used to saying practitioner because it was Trellis and Thrive, and even the module, Kathleen, that you and I done in college, it was term practitioner. And then other places as well, say where Kathleen trained after that, they would use the term facilitator. Francesca also came up with the idea of a kind of hierarchical thing where maybe a practitioner had an assistant facilitator, but I think in reality a lot of us are just one-man band things rather than, and you're just jack of all trades rather than having a structure. But if you had a big enough group of people working together, that maybe the different terminology could be a kind of hierarchical type thing.
Really interesting. Thank you, Marie, and well
Thank you.
Summarised.
Thank you.
And it's great to hear you really began to start picking apart the skills and thinking about the roles in relation to others, and starting to appreciate how addled our brains have been thinking about all this over the last few months, the last few years. So that was lovely. Thank you.
Thank you.
And yeah, the thoughts about terminology varying with field and with country, and this idea of hierarchy. We have come up against this again ourselves and wondered if perhaps we start with a kind of a level that suits most people up across the board, that's maybe not too ambitiously high for training and so on, and then later when we're a more mature profession, a sort of master's level or a more senior therapist level perhaps. So those thoughts have been coming around. It's great to hear them coming out from your groups too. That helps us feel that we're not too far away from what others are thinking in the field. Who would like to report back on another group, please? Don't be shy.
I was taking notes for group 5, and I can't remember who was in my group now. Who did we have? Claire, Caroline, Sally, and Neil. So we started by saying question 1 was far too hard, in terms of what makes an STH practitioner. So we jumped to what would you take away to stop being a practitioner. It was an easier way of trying to get to put a bit of definition around it. And we said the first point was hort skills, being able to relate to the plant and the garden and have a good enough working knowledge to be able to answer questions and be trustworthy and to ensure success in the planting, because that was particularly important. And we started to go a little bit into what qualification, how much qualification is enough, but then we sort of backed our way off that one, as it's relatively easy to define, but still not simple and straightforward. But we felt that people needed to have enough qualification, but more importantly, they also had experience, and qualification on its own wasn't going to cut it. You also need to have actually got out in the garden and done it as well. The second point was it's all about the people, the clients. And we had a debate about defined need, who defines it, and what defines a need, whether, you know, the self-referrals, how defined a defined need is when they get to a garden. But we were clear that it was a therapeutic intervention. It's social and therapeutic horticulture, so the clue's in the name. There is a therapeutic element, therefore there must be a need of some description which is intended to be met through that therapeutic process. And we went into a bit of discussion about entry requirements, and being able to discuss with the person what their needs were in order to be able to meet them, which sort of brought us around to a sort of a definition of it being about a people-centred horticulture to meet individual needs. We started to define what we felt the role of the practitioner was. And then the third element was very much about having the skills to be able to lead or facilitate, to bring the hort and the people together as key bits, and being able to set targets and to measure benefits and measure outcomes. In terms of comparable roles, I think it was, I can't remember who said no, Clara, no, was it Claire? I can't remember who. Sally was saying that her sister is an OT facilitator, which she isn't a qualified OT and works to a qualified OT. So the OT would work with the clinicians to devise the programme. The OT facilitator delivers the programmes to very much a predefined set. And what we felt was an STH practitioner sits somewhere probably between those two, in that they're having to shape programmes and work out what needs to happen as well as deliver them, but probably haven't got that same interaction with the clinicians about the need that a full qualified OT would have had. And then our last thought was about benchmarking the requirements of different professions in terms of the levels, degrees, master level, diploma level, and such like.
Great, thank you. Very thorough, and looks like you got to all the questions, which not every group
We
did.
sort of skipped the first one and went straight to the second one.
Okay, fantastic, thank you. Yeah, and yeah, good to hear some different points, but some common points coming up, which I recognise from our group too. Who would like to report back next?
I'll pick up here from our group, if that's all right, Fiona. I was in a group with Alison, Frederick, Liz, and Fiona, and we largely looked at what sort of pieces needed to be in the jigsaw in terms of what things were essential to be able to do the role. And we came up with the idea that safeguarding was essential for all client groups, that for everything else we needed at least a basic and working knowledge, and depending on which client group then we would need more of one or the other. And the other things we included was a knowledge of mental health conditions, counselling and listening skills. Horticulture, we needed at least to have a basic and thorough knowledge of the basics of how to, say, sow seeds or take cuttings or whatever we were going to do with our client group. There was an element needed in terms of either teaching or leadership skills, at least at a basic level, or group facilitation skills. And depending on what client group you were working with, you might want to have more adapted knowledge in one particular sphere. So if you were working with mental health, you may want to have increased knowledge and training in mental health and handling these client group. Whereas if you were working with, say, people with a physical disability, you may want to have a more working knowledge of how you did that. And that really all the knowledge needed to be adapted. So somebody had to adapt, what they did with the client group they were working with. Anybody else in our group, have I missed anything?
I thought that was absolutely excellent as a summary and tremendously coherent given our discussion.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Kath. That was great, and we did start to get into this adaptive knowledge as being crucial to differentiating your traditional horticulturalist, straight horticulturalist who doesn't have to get along with people or deal with group dynamics, or adapt techniques and tools and skills and design of a garden to the needs of a particular group, and that being some of the heart of the skills of a therapeutic gardening practitioner compared to a straightforward gardener or a practitioner who doesn't use any gardening at all but works in another area of health. I think we still have 2 groups to report back.
Sure, I'm happy to have a go if nobody else. I don't know if Liz, if you wanted to do it, but I'm happy to do it. Okay, right. If you want to just go ahead then.
Yeah, there's a wee bit of interference on the line, but
oh, hang on. Hang on. Needless to say, I'll admit the football's on in the background. The noise it is muted. Right? Is that
I don't know.
Is that it going, Fiona?
I think that's no. I think it's maybe coming from me actually. Just go ahead and we'll just
Are you sure?
Yeah.
Right, I've turned everything off. So
yeah. No, I think I'll turn myself off and let you.
It was very similar to your previous group. Passionate about helping others, ability to teach, to facilitate learning, the ability to observe, ability to have continuous CPD, very similar to the previous group. We talked a lot about mental health and some of the challenges that can throw up. Want to continue using structured programs. Felt that was important. Really great knowledge of the client group and in particular individuals. Good understanding, the ability to take that on. Horty knowledge, so I suppose that kind of ties in again, whether it's horty or whether it's gardening. Life Centre's really, all about the people, isn't it? So it's all about them at the end of the day, so it's that passion for people. And certainly training was really the big thing. Being open, being a very open person. Focus, not the bits that could potentially drive you away. If we lost the focus on our clients' needs, losing structured programs, moving to something that was more informal. And perhaps I just asked a question because it came up in class yesterday, which was about because one of the students was really vocal about essentially Trellis are going to say everybody's ready and they can deal with ADHD, they can deal with mental health, they can deal with physical. So it created a big discussion yesterday in the class, but essentially, and I was interested to hear about inappropriate referrals. Our GP is just referring everybody. So potentially, hopefully I've managed to cover everything, but if there's anything I've missed, maybe one of the others would jump in for me.
I would oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
I just wanted to add, yes, we were talking quite a bit about the safeguarding and that people who are practitioners, they don't feel always equipped, if something comes up, what they could do or who they should turn to get some feedback if they have a complaint against themselves. And yeah, we came also it would be good to have continued development program, as they said in the previous group, and Andrew mentioned, but it would be good to have some structure, probably some tailored more to mental health, as the others said, depending on what direction people are going. I think Alan or Andrew mentioned the defined program would be one of the things which we are doing at STH, and that also manages expectation, and it is good point of engagement. And also for the third point, I think if we put communication and be responsive to the group's needs, that's I think what I added. Thanks.
I'd just add to that. Just going to add, Victoria, that so it did come up about our vulnerabilities as practitioners, and I think that's got to be one of the positives to come out of our meetings here, is that as a body of professionals, we're there to support each other in cases where there may be accusations made about our practice at some point. So I do hope that that'll be one of the outcomes, will be a more supportive network available to all of us from this.
Thanks. Yes, that's absolutely on our radar and one of our big hopes for this. I wonder if I can call on Emma just to say a few words, because she always helps me think this through, thinking about malpractice, scope of practice, backup when you're maybe overwhelmed with inappropriate referrals and you're not coping. How is the training and the code of conduct that we aim to have in the association and this register, how might all that come together in a very short, small nutshell to sort of address some of those vulnerabilities as practitioners and concerns we've just heard about?
I think when we started to look at the competencies that you're all really reassuring to me anyway, mentioning today, these are the sorts of things that we've started to think about, and definitely thinking about that need for people to have the support of one another, but the support also of a body like this new association to fall back on, and all the different types of supervision that exist as well. So that's a piece of work that we as a group will hopefully look at next year, in terms of the types of supervision that might exist for people already, including things like one-to-one, but also peer group supervision is becoming more common in other professions. And I think that ability to connect with one another, given that we are, I think somebody mentioned like a one-man band, so many of us are a one-man band, so we can't always get that supervision that we need right now. Hopefully that will come, but being able to get some supervision from one another with good facilitation of that group should hopefully help. And I think we've started to look at other professions in the UK to see how they handle those sorts of scenarios, to think about how this new association can be supportive in that way. I think Catherine has her hand up there as well.
Yeah. Yes. Can I come to you, Catherine? Please?
Sure. Yeah, I just wanted to sort of as Emma was speaking, she was just sparking some thoughts, and I think one of the reasons getting behind the association, what I hope the association will give people, is the confidence in their own skills and ability to reject an inappropriate referral. Because I know there's a huge amount of pressure on people to say, there's a person in need, I ought to be helping them, but to actually be able to say, actually, I'm not the right person to be helping this person at this time, and to be able to pass them on, refer them on to somebody else who is better, or to have a conversation with their referral process to find them something that is more appropriate. It's about, as professionals, having the confidence to say no as well as to say yes.
Thanks both Emma and Catherine. I'm going to come to you, Kath, in just a sec. But yes, this whole process of thinking about definitions of these roles, the names, and then the scope of our practice, we're going to have to delineate that as well. Delimit where does our practice end, and that's part of this process that we're just starting today, where we really clear through our training, our experience, and our code of conduct that we're going to agree in this group, when we're actually being asked to do something that goes beyond our scope of practice and we need to refer on to someone else, and how we set up that kind of referral pathway that we know who to refer to for certain situations and what that is in our own local context. So there's a lot there that we're starting to unpack, and I knew this would happen. But anyway, I'm going to come back to Kath because she put her hand up first.
Thank you. One of my concerns, and I want to flip it the other way, we've talked about us safeguarding our clients, but one of the things that any regulatory body does is ensure that people that are not safe to work with client groups do not get in. It is particularly a case when people are working as single practitioners, because if you and I are working in a group, you can question my handling of a situation from a therapist point of view. But there are people who are predatory, and you only need to have seen the Nikki Campbell teacher thing recently on the television to know that in even regulated professions, there are people that are predatory to vulnerable people. And we need to make sure that they don't come into this grouping and harm people, because it will shut down potentially the sector.
Yeah, you're right.
So we need to make sure that our clients are safe. And in terms of that, there needs to be some sort of, if there's a regulator, you know, somebody keeping a register of whatever description, they need to have, you know, let me give you an example. If I was going on the dental register, which was what I was on before, I had to once a year say, I have got professional indemnity insurance. I had to tick that before I could have my registration renewed. So this would be of, I have an up-to-date PVG certificate or whatever, you know, as part of the condition of being on that register, such that we can make sure that people are safe.
Thanks, Kath. I'm going to have to very quickly hear the last few people. This is all in our sites, and you make a very valid point, and this is all in our thinking. We do need to cover these things and make sure that malpractice, what is good practice is clear, and also what is malpractice, and make sure that our practitioners are protected and have insurance and good training and all the support they need, but also that and the whole point of this is that to make sure that clients are very, very safe. And the whole professional standards authority question of whether we can be registered or not hinges on whether setting up this register will mean a net public benefit, so that people will be benefited more than they would be harmed by people practicing in the way that we agree. Gosh, there's so much to get through. Can I hear from the last group, please? And then we will need to wrap up.
Yeah, sure. I can probably feedback. I took some notes from the group I was in with Bex and Claire Johnston, and plenty of other things have already been said that we sort of talked about. But without doubt, we had a discussion that put a real emphasis on the STH practitioner being somebody who essentially connects people and engages people in nature, and in particular, you know, if we're talking about horticulture, to plants and the process of growing plants and the care and the nurturing that's involved in that. But we talked about how, you know, the skills to essentially you know, recognize what in the landscape provide you with opportunities to do that. The skills to be able to make sure that a garden or that nature that you're looking after is thriving and doing well in spite of perhaps the adaptations that you make in relation to the needs of the people and the you know, the skills that they have and things like this. So it really focused very much on that connection to nature side of things, and the dedication that and the passion that people have to be able to do that. We talked briefly about what you know, what wouldn't you have to be, you know, what would you take away from an STH practitioner? And, you know, and I think it was people focus. It was perhaps being more focused on, you know, just seeing the processes getting the garden done and doing the job in the garden, rather than necessarily thinking about that engagement side of things. We didn't really get to the third question, but I guess, you know, what comes out here from everybody who always attends this is that professionalism that comes from dedication to serve client gardeners as fully as we can, ensuring they're safe and ensuring that their quality of life is enhanced.
Thank you, Damien. Well, that's a great thought to finish on, I think. What a high-powered meeting for the last one of the year. Thank you, everyone. Those contributions have been so helpful, and it's just really nice to hear everyone's very perceptive comments and concerns and all the different takes on this, but essentially a great deal of shared thinking and commonality. So this has been really encouraging and useful. We don't really have much time to talk about the things that we're working on, but as mentioned and worked on last time, we are going to carry on with working on a code of conduct draft, code of ethics draft, and we have some volunteers who've come forward to help with that. So a working group will take that forward. We asked a few of the volunteers who stepped forward last time to look at our frequently asked questions for the website that'll try to give people a sense of what the professional association is going to do and isn't going to do, and that can be added to at any time. So please send in any comments on that. This was the beginning of our work on definitions, and this is going to be a long-running, ongoing task. We saw how many aspects there are to it tonight, and how many questions and things we have to nail down and maybe review over time. So it's not going to be a quick fix, but it's been a really productive start. Thank you for all your contributions. And we would like to suggest a next meeting in early March, I think. So we will send around some dates soon for that. Likewise, we'll write up some notes and share those. We'll be in touch with those who volunteered, and if anyone else wants to also step forward and volunteer, that's fine, and we will find work for you, I'm sure. I'm wondering if I've missed anything crucial. Can anyone from the rest of the team let me know?
I think you've covered it all. And if I could just add, I've been scribbling away, and I think Bex has been scribbling away. But if anybody did scribble down notes from their discussions and wanted to just pop them on an email, that will just help us with actually capturing what we think you said. And then so there will be a recording as well as a note of the discussions as well. So I think if people who haven't been able to make it will be able to go in on that. And one of the questions which I've had a couple of times off the back of the last meeting and such, like people saying, how can we make sure we're involved in the discussions if we've not made it to the particular forum meetings? And just to say that from pretty much everything that we're discussing, these is a start point, and there will be a process where we'll come out to everybody for further input. So, for example, on the code of ethics, we've got some really good quality material from that last discussion, which Christina has been working through. We've got a small group which is then going to sit down with Christina and pick it all to pieces again, put it all back together again, hopefully, but at least come up with some key questions. And what we'll do, we'll try and come out to everybody with a bit of a survey to say, these are what we think the key questions are, and what's your view on them? And then that way everybody can have their input to it. It doesn't matter whether or not they've been able to make it to these discussion forums or not. So I suspect with the definition, we'll have a similar sort of process where we'll come back with something and test it on the, I think we've got about 270 people in total on the consultative forum. So there's a lot more voices that we do need to make sure that we're hearing in this consultation process.
Thanks, Catherine. Any final comments? I know a couple of people maybe had their hands up and didn't get a chance to speak, but we are trying to stick to time. So but there's still enough of us here. I think anyone who had to go has gone. If there is any burning points that someone would still like to raise. We are still welcoming more people to the group, Claire. Yeah, so if anyone wants to join, they're very welcome. And we will have all these comments. We'll save those with the video. So don't worry if we haven't sort of read out your comments. We will have them, and we will note them. Okay. I'd just like to say thank you to everyone. It's been a really productive evening, and I'd like to wish you all a very Merry Christmas and a happy festive season, healthy festive season, and we look forward to reconvening in the new year. Thanks again for your time tonight.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Fiona.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.